Thank you, Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Greens to speak on the Museums of History Bill 2022 and want to put on the record the fact that we recognise that this bill to establish the Museums of History New South Wales to replace the Sydney Living Museums and amend the State Records Act 1998 to transfer the majority of functions and responsibilities of the current State Archives and Records Authority of New South Wales to the Museums of History New South Wales, along with the majority of their staff and budget is the intention of this bill. The objects of the bill: repeal the Historic Houses Act 1980 and dissolve the Historic Houses Trust and establish and confer functions on the Museum of History's New South Wales, transfer certain functions relating to records management services and assuming control of, recovering and facilitating public access to state records from the State Archives and Records Authority to the Museums of History New South Wales, renamed the SARA as the State Records Authority New South Wales, amends the State Records Act to provide that a record need only be made or received, not kept as well, in order for it to be a state record, and a number of other measures in relation to that, as well as providing for the transfer of assets, liabilities and rights consequent on the establishment of the Museums of History New South Wales, including the transfer of assets of the Sydney Living Museums collection, of State Archives and assets of SARA to the Museums of History New South Wales. It will probably come as no surprise to those in this place who have been following the trajectory of the development of this bill that the Greens do not support this bill and the merging of these different agencies and institutions under the Museums of History Bill. My Greens colleague in the other place, Kate Fairman, wrote a dissenting report to the inquiry and raised key concerns, which I'll go into detail in a minute. But in short, the legislation, which is based on the recommendations of an inquiry into the State Records Act 1998 and the policy paper of its review and the positions outlined in the government's further response to the committee, showed very clearly that in the inquiry, the government expressed their desire to create a single cultural institution to manage state records and perform the function of Sydney Living Museums. The proposed legislation differs to the way that retention of records are held and severely limits the capacity and function of the new organisation. In the dissenting report, which I believe it's important to put on the record, prepared by my Greens colleague in the other place, Kate Fairman, the Greens raised as a primary concern that we did not support the key finding of the inquiry, the proposal that suggested as a key finding that single new cultural institution in place of the State Archives and Records Authority and Sydney Living Museums was strongly supported. It is very clear from the communication that I have received and correspondence around this, as well as my colleague Jamie Parker and the member in the other house for the Greens who raised concerns around this, that there are a number of concerns in relation to the loss of the specialist skills of the state records and archivists, and as well as a concern that the specialist knowledge, the expertise and the recognition of the value of the historic houses and of other elements of our history in the state will be lost in the merging of the Museums of History New South Wales and bringing this into a single cultural institution. It's important that we recognise that there are also always, when we look at this, slippages from this Liberal National Government when it comes to looking at what we are doing in relation to our cultural institutions, our historic institutions, and the need or desire to want to engage in further commercial related activities in those spaces, and there are understandably concerns that have been raised. And I'd like to just provide on the record some detail of the dissenting report from my Greens colleague in the other place, who wrote, "The majority of evidence, in fact, received from witnesses with extensive experience in the state's management and preservation of government records spoke to the significant risks posed to the critical role that an agency such as SARA plays in government accountability through its statutory record-keeping obligations. This evidence was compelling and convincing. Therefore, as the New South Wales Greens representative on this committee, I sought to move a number of amendments to the report." And Ms Fairman then goes into the details of her concerns around one of the key findings and sought to remove paragraphs that attempted to suggest that there was broad support or strongly support strongly supported to move into this single new cultural institution. Unfortunately, the committee did not support that, and so now we are moving into a position where before us we have this bill that will move these entities into a single new cultural institution. There was also concern raised about the privatisation and commercialisation of an essential government service. Ms Fairman sought to replace an existing paragraph in the report that said that basically noted the concerns around the commercial operations and the risks around that, but unfortunately it again failed to be included. Ms Fairman also urged the consideration to be given to the new board makeup, urging that some of the most, and I'm quoting here, urging that some of the state's most experienced archivists and historians to be included in the board, and also the need to recognise First Nations and Aboriginal access to and management and involvement in terms of records. And that amendment thankfully did get up in that, and I note that the minister responsible for this legislation also has responsible for First Nations legislation, and I would hope that that would be a primary focus when we're looking at how we're moving forward when it comes to looking at the issues of the Museums of History New South Wales and our state records and archives. One of the things that I think is really clear from this, and I wanted to use an example that has been recently raised with me in the instance of the powerhouse, is there's a slippage that occurs in our cultural institutions, and we can take the carriage works in my local electorate as well as examples of this, where basically we have moved to sort of make cultural institutions, if you like, more accessible, entertainable, usable by people. And when you're talking about things like state records and archives and in maintaining historic houses and the value of our history, it is important that we recognise that they're not always going to be the most exciting, the most appealing, the most engaging places to be able to hold opening events, to be able to hold fashion parades, to be able to hold other activities and engagements. And there is a real concern about the slippage between the primary purpose of state records and archives and where we might be heading with the idea of turning this into a single entity. I also have been contacted by a number of other stakeholders who have raised key issues with the bill, particularly that the bill is not creating museums of New South Wales history, but it does not change the new entity, Museums of History New South Wales, with responsibility, does not charge, the new entity of Museums of History New South Wales with the responsibility for collecting and interpreting New South Wales history. It also raises concerns that the bill merges two organisations with very different functions and responsibilities and skills that have little in common. It raises further concerns that there are a number of different stakeholders that have not been engaged in the process, that New South Wales needs a clear museum policy and strategy before considering such drastic changes. And it also raises concerns in relation to the ad hoc decision making and the risks around that in relation to the involvement and consideration of Indigenous cultural heritage. It also has a huge concern that there are no government archives anywhere in the world that are managed under an organisation such as that proposed in the bill. Now, there are some things which obviously New South Wales might want to be a first on, but when it comes to the academic and the expert evidence, when it comes to dealing with government archives and state records, I think it would be pretty clear to say that it's important that we are in line with the best practice, and that doesn't necessarily mean going out on our own and establishing new ways of doing these things. It's really important to recognise also that place-based museums are not vacant spaces for random historical exhibitions and contemporary art installations that are unrelated to that place. There are specific needs and benefits of having place-based museums as they are, recognising their purpose and they are not just an infrastructure or an empty shell to have other artworks or other exhibitions or other events held or played. The final thing that I will take in relation to this to just put on the record is that the Greens will be watching very closely as to how this evolves with genuine concern, working closely, and I want to acknowledge the archivists and the experts in this field that have worked closely with the Greens, my colleague Kate Fem and myself and Jamie Parker, who holds our heritage portfolio, to identify the very many concerns that they hold in this bill, and we will continue to work with them with possible amendments in the other place to be able to address them. The final thing, if I may, Speaker, just in relation to this, and if I can seek a brief extension of time, Speaker, just by a couple of minutes would be great.
The member for Newtown seeking an extension. All those in favour say aye.
Thank you, Speaker.
Against no. Thanks for the enthusiasm.
Thank you. Thank you, Speaker. I just wanted to take a minute, given that the Minister is present listening to this debate. I feel it would be remiss of me to not talk about the absence of a theatre archive, a National Performing Arts or Theatre Archives in the country of Australia, and put it on the agenda of the Minister and of the government and all of those that are interested in this to discuss this. It's one of the things that has been a passion of mine for a long time. It was the focus of my PhD research, which sadly I didn't finish because John Howard became such a racist that I decided I was going to get into politics instead. But I was writing on the need for a National Theatre Archive, and I think sorry, I realise I just totally lost the Liberal crowd at that point. Apologies, or anyway. But just to say that I think the thing that I wanted to talk about in the context of this is one of the things that I think is really important and is a gap, is that two areas within our society that currently don't have clear national museums or institutions to be able to capture. One is the performing arts and live performance, and they're an incredible example of that at the Theatre and Film and Tape Archive in New York, and at London at the Theatre Museum, and also in Netherlands at their Theatre and Performing Arts Archive. And the other thing that I wanted to put on the agenda is the long push for the need for an LGBTI history museum or archive. And I just think if we are talking about what this looks like, and if there is a genuine commitment to want to look at the potential for New South Wales to lead the way to do that isn't necessarily to be trying to rebrand and rebadge very different cultural institutions and archival institutions to be agencies to be able to do their work, but potentially have incredible flagship opportunities to establish new museums and places where we can record and capture the history. And I think Sydney is an incredible place that would be well placed to host both a National Theatre Archive as well as a LGBTI community archive that recognises the ongoing contribution that both the performing arts and also the LGBTI community make to our state and to our country. And I think that they are the positive things that we could be talking about in the context of improving the engagement with museums and historical organisations and institutions in our state. Thank you, Speaker.